Skeptics will argue for skepticism, conservatives will argue for conservatism, liberals will argue for liberalism, postmodernists will argue for postmodernism, and on it goes. And what baffled me as I was studying these various schools of thought is that I noticed a meta pattern amongst all these different schools and philosophers, which was that all of them were biased towards their own position and against those of others. I didn't see fair treatment. I didn't see a scientist fairly considering the position of the Muslim. I didn't see a Muslim fairly considering the position of the skeptic or the atheist. I didn't see the atheist fairly considering the position of someone practicing witchcraft. I didn't see conservatives fairly, honestly, genuinely trying to understand the position of liberals, nor the opposite. And this immediately struck me as the number one problem of all of life. Because how am I supposed to discover what's true if I myself am going to act this way? If I'm just going to present skewed arguments towards my own pet theories, then I'm not genuinely inquiring into the actual nature of reality. I don't actually care about what the truth is. All that I'm doing is I'm playing a persuasion game where I'm trying to persuade others to believe what I believe. And of course, in the process, I'm also, first and foremost, trying to persuade myself with these talking points that what I believe is true and that I actually understand reality when in fact I don't. And so the key error that I found throughout all of Western philosophy is that no Western philosopher seriously acknowledges their own self-bias. And of course, this isn't just limited to philosophy. We're talking about all basically intellectual pursuits. And this struck me as a huge problem. And I didn't see anybody talking about this problem, which struck me as kind of odd because it seemed so obvious that this was such an important problem. And I didn't see any solutions to this problem either. There were no simple solutions. Because what I was interested in truth. I didn't care what the truth was per se. My position was that whatever the truth is, even if it's ugly or even if it contradicts everything that I believe, I would rather have that than my own pet theories. And so with this, I began a serious investigation to the nature of life and reality and human knowledge, which ultimately led me to Actualized.org and to mysticism, to non-duality, to enlightenment, and all of that. So the biggest obstacle in philosophy is that truth requires impartiality and objectivity. But how do you be impartial? It's not nearly as easy as people assume. You might think, well, okay, I'll just be impartial. I'll just do an impartial investigation into all the different philosophies, and then I'll find the true right one. But the problem goes much deeper than this, you see, because it's very tricky. Who is going to judge whether you're being objective or impartial? Because it's not enough just to tell yourself that you're objective and impartial, because, of course, you're the judge and the jury and the one on trial in this case. See? So who are you going to ask whether you're actually truly being objective? Are you going to ask yourself? And then what is your mind going to tell you? Of course, it's going to tell you that you are objective. The whole problem is that all of these different philosophies and schools believe that they're objective and that they're impartial. You ask a Christian or a Muslim if they're impartial, what are they going to say? Yes? What are they going to say? No? Of course they're going to say that they're impartial. But see, the problem is that if you are self-biased already towards a certain position, then you're not going to be able to see your own self-bias. And therefore, your bias is going to be the problem, because if you're going to just blindly follow your bias will just say, well, Christianity is true. How do I know it's true? Well, because I say it's true. Same thing for science and anything else. See? There's a question begging going on here with all these different worldviews that I want you to notice. The person doesn't truly question the very foundations of their worldview because it's just taken for granted, and it's not even realized that it could be a problem. It's just assumed that it's valid. So, for example, you ask a scientist, well, how do you know science is true? Why are you a scientist? Why do you trust in science? And the scientist will tell you this whole spiel about the history of science and all the technology that's been invented and how good science is and the scientific method and how it's all been much better than all the alternatives like witchcraft and voodoo and mysticism and religion and all that nonsense. And that, of course, we know science is objective and impartial. But how do you know that? The problem is that the scientist is going to use scientific and rational arguments to try to validate science. But that's begging the question, because the very thing that we're trying to question here is, how do we know that the very mechanism, the epistemic mechanism that you're using, all those scientific methodological assumptions, how do you know those actually lead to truth? The scientist will, of course, use further science to try to prove that science leads to truth, which is exactly as absurd as asking a Christian, why do you believe in God? And then the Christian says, well, because of the Bible. And then why do you believe in the Bible? Well, because God wrote the Bible and God wouldn't lie. See, it's a vicious circle. Because what we're questioning here is, did God really write the Bible? Did God really not lie? Or maybe God is a liar. How do you know? Well, Leo, the Bible says God can't be a liar. Yeah, but what we're questioning is the Bible correct? So you can't assume that the Bible is correct, nor can you assume that God is not a liar. Maybe God is a liar. You don't know. Maybe the devil wrote the Bible. You don't know. If you're being objective and impartial, the problem, though, is precisely that you're being partial. You're not being objective. You're favoring the thing that you're trying to prove. And so in this sense, you're not actually making a proof. So what I'm telling you is that most scientists who buy into science, they don't buy into science because they've proven that science is valid. It's actually the other way around. They buy into science, and therefore they then rig their entire scheme of justifications and all of their logic to validate that science is correct. They assume that science is correct, and then they use science to validate that science is correct. Same thing for Muslims, Christians, Jews, and everybody else. And so this is the mechanism that I saw when I was about 18 years old. This shook me to my core. It changed my life forever when I realized this. This wasn't something that I read in a book or that somebody told me. I sat down one night, late at night, by myself in my room. I can still vividly remember the night, with just a sheet of paper trying to reason this stuff through. And when I saw this infinite black hole of groundlessness into which all of these worldviews and philosophies ultimately vortex their way down into, because they're all groundless, they're all predicated upon circular reasoning. When I saw that, it really shook me. It really opened up my mind. And that was the doorway towards ultimately being able to understand awakening. But that would take decades for me to really understand it. I didn't know at the time that I was just like licking the tip of the iceberg of how deep this problem goes. This basically explains why people trick themselves into believing all sorts of crazy worldviews. They don't have enough consciousness or awareness to see the question-begging nature of their own self-bias. See? Isn't it funny how if you ask a Christian, are you biased? They always say no. And if you ask a scientist, are you biased? He says, of course not, I'm a scientist. Our whole objective is not to be biased. But then you can go around and do that with every single crazy belief and worldview that people have held since the dawn of time. And they will all deny that they're biased. So what good is the denial? What's it worth? It ain't worth shit. And that's when I started to really suspect a problem within science. I saw that scientists were not seriously interested in this problem, because generally scientists are just interested in like executing science. They're not interested in questioning science. Not very deeply, because they just assume it to be true. And why do they assume it to be true? Because they were indoctrinated into it in their culture when they were growing up, through their schooling and through university and so forth, through their parents, through TV shows, through books they read, through science fiction or whatever. And the same thing goes for Christians, atheists, and everybody else. It's nothing very original is happening here. Nobody is really being intelligent. They're just executing. They're executing pre-existing conditioning and programming. And so I started to question all of this. And so at this point in my life, I started to identify most with being a skeptic. Because to me, skeptics were the closest of all the different schools of thought, especially the ancient Greek skeptics, the Pyrrhonians, were the closest to taking this problem seriously. Everybody else seemed to just kind of gloss over it as though it's not a big deal.